Hello, everyone. It's Greg. I'm here, another episode of the Opportunity Podcast. Today, I am talking with Timothy Swieter, who ran Systainer. He became the largest dealer of Systainer in all of America with this product that he was basically importing from Germany. And this is a pretty cool story. Like all the other dealers, they could not do what he did, which eventually featured, I think it was like about 400 SKUs in his product catalog. And the cool thing was, he's like this business, he ended up selling it, and for a large portion of its success, it was actually a side hustle. He was working another job, like his W 2, all that kind of stuff while doing this. And before he got into all this crazy space of internet marketing, e commerce, you may have written something that he engineered because he used to be basically an Imagineer at Disney and help build like roller coasters and rides for Disney and Universal Parks. So, really cool guy, very humble dude. And he dropped some really good wisdom, especially towards the end, that if you are looking to sell your business, I think this is great advice. It's not like, a tactical advice like do X and get Y, but rather it's the more emotional advice, which I think a lot of entrepreneurs never really consider when it comes to making a successful exit. So with that said, I'll stop talking and let's get into the show. I'll see you on the other side. All right, everyone. I got Tim Swieter here with me today to talk shop about a pretty interesting story, a pretty unique story of what happened to you. But Tim, for my audience who may not be familiar with you, why don't you just do a quick introduction of who you are, what do you do, and where you're at in the world?
Awesome. Thank you, Greg. I'm glad to be here. Well, I'm Tim Swieter, as you said, and I build awesome things with great people, have fun, and make money. Basically, that sums up, a series of career transitions that we can get into in this podcast. I currently live in Cleveland, Ohio, and my background has been in electrical engineering and also entrepreneurship and business design. I would say right now I'm in my third act of my career, transitioning to a bit more consulting and also continuing to build my portfolio of businesses.
Yeah, you have a quite interesting portfolio of work. So that kind of leads into, my first question here for you is how did you go from building, roller coasters, fireworks shows for Disney and Universal to starting your own e-commerce business? Like walk me through this transition. I'm assuming that's act one and e-commerce
Yeah.
was your act two. But walk
Yeah,
me through the story.
totally. Well, getting into Act One, I grew up in Michigan area, and my family would take these vacations to Florida for like spring break or Christmas break, and we would go to like Disney World and we go to Universal Studios, and it got to be maybe high school age when I was like, hey, who builds these places? They're kind of unique, the sounds, the ride experiences, all that stuff. And that's when I learned about Imagineering and this whole group of engineers and designers that put these unique experiences together. And I said, I'm going to do that. And so I pursued engineering, electrical engineering and design. And then I got to do that for 12 years over a course doing attractions throughout the world. And, going though from like engineering and theme park engineering to entrepreneur, like there's always been this thread of entrepreneur in me. So like when I was young, my brother and I, we would go on the golf course because we lived on a golf course at the time. We'd find the balls in the weeds, we'd dive in the pond, we'd get the balls out, and we'd resell them to golfers on the side, as they're coming up to the tee, right? We'd clean up the balls. And so it was just a way of like finding a value we could add. But then even when I was in theme park engineering, I lived in a small business. So it was like, how do I serve a customer? How do I create this proposal? How do I then deliver the work that we said that we are going to do? And while I was in Asia, because 8 of those 12 years I did entertainment engineering, I was in Asia. And I found other opportunities, side hustles there, where I was like sourcing things out of the Shenzhen electronics market and then selling that online through around the world, doing some of my own circuit board design for like hobby electronic stuff. So the transition was natural, I would say, going from theme park engineering to my second act, which we can talk about, was more of like I wanted to intentionally design businesses. I wanted to go from just having a side hustle or being in a project workspace to like how in the world do you craft an offering for a customer.
So we're going to talk about this trainer, but I gotta ask, when you were in Hong Kong, were you working on like the Disneyland of Hong Kong? Is that what you were doing?
That's correct. Yep. That's what initially brought me over to Asia was Hong Kong Disneyland. And then I went to Singapore for Universal Studios Singapore. And then Shanghai Disneyland was then also a project where I spent some time in Shanghai, but mostly lived in Hong Kong. And then there was other things that we did throughout Asia as well.
That's pretty cool. I went to the Hong Kong Disneyland after I got married in Hong Kong. We were talking about that a little bit
Awesome.
offline. So, like, my best friend, he actually lives in Shenzhen, or he did. He's moved now,
Yeah.
but
Yep.
he lived there, so he like came down to celebrate. He was like my only witness for the wedding, along with my lawyer
Yeah.
in the co-working
Uh-huh.
space. But then we went to Disneyland afterwards. That's cool, man. You're sourcing some stuff from China. You're doing some side hustles. You decide, you know what, I'm going to like build an actual enterprise here. Was that Systainer,
Hmm.
or did you have some other brands before Systainer that you attempted?
Yeah, so I had some other e-commerce things. Like I said, I've always had some amount of side hustles. And so when I lived in Asia, I actually had a website called Brildia. It was kind of like brilliant and idea smashed together, Brildia. And it was selling various circuit boards and LEDs, programmable LEDs, so you could create some lighting displays. And it sold to a handful of hobbyists. I did a couple small projects where I installed lighting displays for like some customer storefronts, like physical storefronts and some churches and whatnot. But it was kind of like my first like sit down, write my own code, integrate the PayPal button, and I fulfilled them out of my apartment with my wife in Asia. So that was kind of like the first real e-commerce thing that I did. But the going to the intentional business making was like it was career transition as well. Like I stopped doing theme park engineering. I moved back to the US and I joined a corporate innovation company for Steelcase. They make commercial office furniture, desk chairs and things like that. But I know nothing about the furniture. I was hired to go and design new business models that were using like IoT sensors in the office space and data science and how can we learn about how people work in order to improve services that we can offer people, that are working in an office. And then it was that transition when I went back to the US. I was like, hey, I get to own a house now. I get to set up a garage. I get to have it's all these things that I didn't have for like,
Hong Kong is
in
a
the 8
hard
years
is
that
a
I lived in
hard
Asia.
place to own
Yeah,
a house. You got
exactly.
to own Disneyland.
That's right. That's right. So I was there. I was setting up a little bit of workshop because I like to make. I'm not a woodworker. I don't just do things in wood. I like to 3D print. I like to laser. I like to, assemble kits, whatever. And I wanted a workshop. And part of that is like, what's my storage system in the workshop? And that's when I started looking deeper at Systainer. So Systainer is made by a company out of Germany called Tanos. There's lots of different plastic toolbox and storage systems out there. And I was like, as I was looking at Systainer, I was realizing, hey, there's only like two places that offer this in the US. And one of them is kind of more of a physical retail kind of store. And I was seeing people online saying, hey, where can I get a yellow Systainer or where can I get a black Systainer? And then I was looking at the Tanos catalog, which had like 400 SKUs in it at the time. And the dealers here in the US and the place in the US were carrying like 30 of those SKUs. And over time, I guess I would say I've developed this skill to always kind of look for opportunities. So it's not like there was like this instant light bulb moment, but there was this, hey, I'm going to send an email to him and see if there's an opportunity to sell stuff in the US.
This is interesting. So I always like entrepreneurial stories where you're kind of solving your own problem as the start of the business,
Hmm.
which sounds kind of like how you fell into it.
Yeah.
But this is sort of unique because the product already existed, but it wasn't really in the USA market. So maybe
Hmm.
give me the landscape of like how did that email go, and like why weren't the other dealers? Correct me if I'm wrong, but I think you were selling all of their SKUs towards the end of it, right? Why did the other dealers not do it? So walk me through how this happened.
Yeah. So let's go back to that email. I fired off this email and I forget exactly what the date was, but it was in 2017, late 2017, and a couple months went by. And again, like a couple times a month, I will find some sort of opportunity and I fire off an email, and several times you just don't hear things back. Sometimes the
I know
conversation
how that
fizzles out. It's
goes.
nothing, right?
Trust me.
Yeah. Yep. Yep.
I sent a lot of
But
emails, as you know.
yeah, yeah. So I was actually in San Francisco on a business trip with my day job at the time, and my phone rang, and it's got a San Francisco number on it, and I was like, "Oh, okay, maybe the hotel, maybe my contact, the people I'm meeting or whatever." And I answer it, and the guy goes, "Hi, I'm Frank from Tanos. You would like to start distributing Systainers?" And I had to like stop for a moment and go, "Oh yeah, yeah, Systainers. That's right. I sent you the email." And so like it immediately worked out. Like we met for breakfast like later that trip because he was living in San Francisco or just outside of San Francisco. I was there, and over a series of then a couple conversations, I learned that Tanos, what it was is they weren't intentionally going into the US market at that time. And so they had almost no dealers, as we said, because the dealers had to buy such a certain quantity of container sizes, containers full of sustainers to bring in. And those dealers were focused on other things. They had other tool businesses and stuff. They weren't committing fully to a container. But what I learned then was Tanos was starting to make a commitment to the market here. They were setting up a warehouse here, and so therefore they were opening the doors to sourcing some dealers, and I was on the list because of that email. And so one thing led to another, and by the fall of 2018, I had set up my first e-commerce shop for Systainer Store.
Fascinating. So they're basically wholesaling it to you. You're acting as the digital retail front for them for their catalog in the USA. What were some of
Exactly.
the challenges you faced as you started like launching and growing this?
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Some of the challenges were first getting like the name out there, right? Because there are communities, if you will, there are niches that know Sustainer in the US, but then starting to say, hey, we are truly selling it here in the US. I had to, get into those niches without feeling too scammy or salesy or whatever.
It's like
And you know
this
what I
the
mean?
caution in the subreddit, like, do I post? Do I
Yeah,
not post?
yeah, exactly. And so, it was, I wanted to find myself, I needed to craft myself into a subject matter expert. I wanted to learn everything there was about sustainers, and I needed to craft myself and the business into like, how can I help you? Like, how can I do this? Like, someone on the forum might post a question about a sustain. Hey, can I get this in XYZ color? Or can I get this in this height? Right. And so I'd go and quickly, read the catalog. I'd go talk to Tanos if I didn't understand something right. So there's a bit of, product knowledge that I had to ingest and so that I could turn around and then, hey customer or hey forum really, because I wasn't a customer yet. I'd say, hey, of course you can do this. Or I go downstairs and I had a handful in my shop. I would take pictures, if someone's asking some sort of detail about a dimension. And so I like got into these communities and then, my footer on some of my posts would then start saying, hey, you can buy sustainers at my store, sustainer.store. Right. And so that started generating some traffic. So that was one of my challenges was initially kind of breaking into these niches. I would say there's another challenge that even to this day we still deal with is like the sustainer, it's actually an OEM product. So Tanos makes this and they sell it as their own brand, Tanos and the Systainer. But then Tanos is also a sister company to a large power tool manufacturer called Festool, right? And Festool is a high-end woodworking tool. A lot of the Festool power tools come in a Systainer. And so even to this day, I'll get emails, maybe a couple times a month saying, hey, is your Systainer a knockoff of a Festool Systainer? Because the Festool brand is so much more known than the toolbox product line, right? And so we have to do these justifications, do these product shoots with a Festool Sustainer in it, so that they realize like we're not a knockoff; it's all from the same factory.
We're literally the
So
same company, basically.
yeah, yeah, yeah,
Oh, that's funny. I can see that
yeah,
being an issue. I want to double click a bit
mm,
on the traffic thing with what you're doing.
yeah,
I really like this approach. So, like, yeah, if I do something very similar, like if I'm in a subreddit, Facebook group, if something's related to M&A, especially around
yeah,
digital businesses, I tend to be the commenter on those things to like help people out, whether they use us or not.
yeah,
Always like to
yep.
help people out, and I think that's a good way to do content. But what were you doing exactly to bring the traffic? So, are these like Facebook groups with these niche, like sustainer communities? Where was it
Yeah,
coming from?
yeah, I would say I not as much into Facebook, but there were a couple like forums that were set up online for Festool, and then Festool, as the power tool again, and then they might have a specific subtopic on Systainer. So the Festool owners group was one of those communities where I just wanted to say, hey, I want to be a part of this community. I want to help this community out, and then had to kind of grow integrity, if you will, with that and trust in that community by serving them and answering questions. So it was like a regular habit where every day in the morning I'd wake up, or every couple days I'd wake up and I would make sure I go into that forum and I answer those questions and respond if someone DM'd me or something like that.
Yeah, this reminds me early days of me at EF. I was doing so much stuff like this. Are you familiar with like SEO tools like Ahrefs, SEMrush?
Yep, I
So
know of them. Yes. Mhm.
in my earlier days at EF, I used Ahrefs and I put Quora.com into Ahrefs, into the Keyword Explorer,
Mhm.
and found every single question ranking on page one related to like buying or selling a business, which was a
Mhm.
lot. And I answered all of them to get the search traffic and also the Quora traffic. And I think at my peak,
Yeah.
did like 100,000 views in a month, all organic. And it's still to this day, it
Mhm.
drives traffic to us, like a lot of that stuff still gives me traffic. But yeah, just
Yeah.
answering
Yeah.
people's questions is a really like guerrilla marketing strategy that can do some wonders for you when you're at the smaller scale.
Yeah, I would
Yeah.
say if I got another thing like that was kind of how I got that initial traction, but then kind of if you will, when I started to get a lot of traction was maybe when I started getting into Instagram. But I was 3 years into my business before I really started getting into Instagram. And it was that same thing, but instead I could craft the community a little bit more because I could post more interesting visuals about what is a sustainer and how do you use it and how, what tools fit in it. And then that even led to a whole nother offshoot that we could talk about where I started creating a whole website related to that. But it was the Instagram thing again, like crafting the community, serving the community. I'm not an expert at SEO, and I didn't pay much at all for ads. It was like just finding this community around this product and making sure I had what they needed.
So walk me through your Instagram strategy. Like I'm a marketing nerd, but
Mhm.
I've never been
Yeah.
able to make organic social media work for me.
Yeah,
So
yeah, yeah. And don't get me wrong, I might be small scale on like an Instagram front. I had, what was it, around 3,000 followers when the acquisition finally occurred on Sustainer Store. But like in this niche, it was like it's a repeat business. That's what's a great thing about sustainers. And so, a new product comes out or they buy a new tool and they want to put it in a sustainer, it's a repeat business. So Instagram for me was about showing the applications, not the generic product shots or the computer generated product shots. It was like real life things. And I would start to get users that would submit content to me. Hey, I got my new sustainer in. Thanks so much for shipping it on time. Hey, here's where I put it in my workshop, right? And I started to get this content in, and I started to ask, hey, can I post this on Instagram? And I learned some people are like, yeah, and tag me, right? And some people are like, no, I never want anything to do with social media. So I was like, well, I can do it completely anonymous. And then they'd be like, okay, right? And I started to develop this library of content, and I realized on Instagram, it's ephemeral in a sense, right? It's there for a little bit and then it's gone. And then, say 2 months from now, I would have someone write in and say, hey, can XYZ saw fit in a sustainer? And it's like, oh man, I made a post about that, a couple months ago,
yeah.
right? And so this, I know we didn't script this or talk about going into this, but I actually developed a whole website called sustainer.works. And the whole purpose is it's like a Pinterest where this content can exist, evergreen content can exist out on the web and we can start tagging, hey, this saw fits in this sustainer. And oh, by the way, you can go buy that sustainer store. Or hey, if you want to do a fit out, a certain kind of foam around the tool in the sustainer, here's how someone did it. And there can be some step by steps. And so Instagram, Sustainer works, and then that also led into what I called the Friday Fit Out favorites. So it ended up being this consistent email series that I could send out for Sustainer Store subscribers. And between those three things, it's like I'm really serving the community because I'm inspiring them, I'm showing them how to use stuff, I'm helping them think of use cases they didn't have before, and ultimately leads to going back to my theme park days. It leads to that gift shop that's at the exit of the ride. Exit through retail. Buy the shirt because you enjoyed the experience, sort of thing. So.
I love that, man. That's just like all good quality content. And something about that makes me just love the internet. Like, how niche can you get,
Mhm.
right? Like, I have a thing that I do that I had never actually did in my real life. I still watch content on it, which is van life stuff. Like, I've been into
Yep.
van
Yep.
life forever, like before it was cool. Back when I first started talking about it, people were like,
Mhm.
what a creepy thing to do. But
Yeah,
I
yeah.
like love watching the van like conversion models, all that kind of stuff. So
Mhm.
this is cool, man. I think that's a smart strategy and using a very smart use of UGC. The point you mentioned about
Mhm.
like, I posted about that 2 months ago. Like this is every content marketer's woe. Like, like I
Yeah.
literally posted it. I know why don't you guys see it? But like, as you said, the internet is ephemeral, so you got to keep reminding them. And over time, you build a
Yeah.
content vault. Just keep on using it because more and more powerful, right? So I think that is really
Mhm.
smart. So the traffic as you grew Sustainer, which you grew into becoming like the largest dealer in America for this, was
That is correct.
primarily from you answering questions and your Instagram profile. Were you doing anything else in your marketing mix?
Not really. I mean, I remember I like when I first launched my store, I set up, hey, $75 a month to Google Ads for a handful of words around sustainers and organization. And then somewhere around the 2 year mark, I said, well, maybe I should spend $100 on that. And then
you're
I
scaling.
never
You're
touched it.
scaling, Tim.
Yeah, I was. And then I never touched it. And I know, again, I think it works for my particular business. I don't know if that's a formula I would say for everyone. And it worked for my particular business because I was a niche. I was a niche that had a specific community I was serving. And yeah, there's a bit of like, how do you grow the pie? How do you make more people aware of sustainers? And some of that would come through Instagram and interactions. I started some YouTube stuff and interactions there so that other, if you will, verticals beyond woodworkers and trade skills people would start seeing it. So we started to get into some of the medical spaces and other areas where sustainers fits well, engineering, technicians. But primarily it was user generated content and being a reliable, trustable source for sustainers. Something we briefly mentioned earlier was other dealers. So there's 3, 4 other dealers. Other dealers carried just a handful of the SKUs, right? And I had to scale. Like I didn't instantly carry the 400 SKU catalog. Like I started with just one color, one size. And then over time, as the business grew and as I had more cash, I was able to invest in the entire catalog. So I would bring in all the colors and I'd be the only dealer in the US that had all the colors available. So I became this authority then where it's like, if I want it, that's the only place to get it. And, repeat, treat a customer well. In a couple months, they're going to need another sustainer and they're going to come to you for it.
So you made me think of a question for you on this. So it sounds like a lot of the customers, at least on the B2C side, are like kind of high end tradespeople
Yeah.
of some sort, or
Yep.
trades hobbyists at
Yeah.
least. But it sounds like there's a
Yeah.
B2B element to this too. You mentioned medical stuff, business. What's the mix of your B2B and B2C customers?
I struggled with that for many years, right? Because I would see, really, because if I go to the higher level Tanos for a moment, Tanos wants to sell OEM sustainers. So they sell, pallets and pallets of custom sustainers to Festool and to Merca and to, other companies that want to integrate their product, right? And then there's the once someone has gotten into the system, there's that consumer aspect. I'm a hobbyist woodworker or I'm a tradesman on the side and I use sustainers, right? But then there is this small business of, day-to-day tradesmen or engineers or dental technicians or whatnot that I started to see. But it wasn't until maybe like year 3 or 4 that I started to see this and trying to intentionally track a B2B sale. And it's deceptive because for a while I was trying to do it by ship address, but they don't always put a commercial address. It was their residence address because maybe it's an electrician that, is a company of two, right?
Their corporate
Yeah,
headquarters is their home.
exactly. And their
Yeah.
email address might not reveal that at all. Their shipping
Gmail
address might
or
not reveal
Hotmail.
it.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yep. And so
Yeah.
only just recently, since the acquisition, we tried to put in some more things. And I put in like a survey right at the checkout. After you've checked out, there's a 3-question survey. And I have learned so much from doing that where, we don't get 100% response, but just the response rate, we were starting to see like a 50-50 mix where 50% of the people, 100 people were responding out of, say, maybe 300 exposures. 100 people were responding and 50 were saying, hey, we are buying this for business purposes, or no, we're buying this for personal purposes. And I was surprised at the 50-50 because I thought it'd be more like a 25 business and a 75 personal. But now we're starting to actually get some more traction with the small businesses and starting to see them more, I guess, in some of the addresses, more established businesses versus, John's Painting LLC at gmail.com. Sorry, John, if that's your real address. I don't know. But,
Not revealing customer
so
information.
yeah, yeah, yeah,
That's brilliant, man.
yeah.
I always love e-commerce stores that have both B2C and B2B. It's such a shame you
Hmm.
sold it, Tim, but now you get the chance to get the buyer to sell it with me.
Yeah, yeah,
But
yeah, yeah, yeah.
that's cool, dude. Like I see all sorts of
Yep.
potential there if you can target the tradespeople, like a direct mail campaign, like not just like online, but I could see a lot of different
Yeah,
paths you could go. But
yeah.
let's talk about this. So you became the biggest dealer. Why do you think you became the biggest dealer, not the others? Is it because the others were just not as focused in Sustainer? They had like Sustainer was just kind of like a side income for them.
Yeah, I think, well, there's a couple reasons we touched on. One would be I eventually got the whole catalog offering, right? And so they could only get something from me, right? And so that's part of like
Oh, was that
winning the customer.
exclusive?
It wasn't like a signed exclusive. It was just I was the only one that chose to do it,
Ah,
right?
I
So
see.
like any other dealer could have gone and done this. So then why didn't the other dealers do it? Well, 2 or 3 of the other dealers, they're big tool stores, right? So the, if you will, the Tool Nuts, the Acme, the Home Depot, that sort of thing, right? You could go and it's like I can buy DeWalt and Milwaukee and Makita and all these other things. And they look at Systainer as one of the brands that they want to add to dozens of brands that they have in the store. And well, Systainer takes up a lot of rack space, if you will, right? You're going to have a handful of pallets of these. It takes up a fair bit of rack space, warehouse space. And so they didn't see the investment of carrying every color for the trade-off that they would get in sales versus all their other stuff. They rather carry a power tool that's, this size that they can get, $200-300 for versus a Systainer that's this size that they get $100 for, right? And so I'd say one reason is that I got the whole catalog. The other one is just cementing the brand as being I am the Sustainer store. That's all I sell. That's all I know. I am the trusted expert on this stuff. And so as people get into the system, it is a repeat buy sort of system. And so that helped with the growth. Tanos eventually, even though they serviced all dealers, as Tanos had people approach them directly and would say, hey, I want to get XYZ in the US, they would say, hey, go to Tim. He's got everything in the catalog, right? You can get it there. So it ends up being, even though it's a dealer relationship and they wanted to be impartial, they wanted to treat all dealers, it was like they would funnel some business towards me because, I would be the only one that carried the product.
Well, that brings me to a question I probably should have asked earlier. So you
Mhm.
mentioned like shipping entire pallets. So do you have like a warehouse you're
Yeah.
storing all this stuff? Like, what's the logistics behind
Oh
this?
yeah.
Oh
Yeah,
yeah,
yeah. So
just
yeah,
like how much storage space. Like this might be a point of
yeah.
contention for you. The
No,
shipping costs.
oh yeah, there's some good stories here though. But so we had referenced that I did some other e-commerce stuff in the past, some other side hustles in the past. And when I was doing that stuff in Hong Kong, I'm shipping small circuit boards, things that fit in postal packages size stuff, right? And more often than not, it would be my wife on her way to work. I'd say, "Hey, can you stop by the Hong Kong post office and send this out?" So and they got to be sometimes I had, some hit on some of the big blogs and I got like 200 orders in a weekend or something for this circuit board, right? And she's like, "Tim, I don't ever want to ship this stuff again." So as I was thinking about this new sustainer stuff, I'm in the US. She's like, "Our garage is not going to be our warehouse. You need to go figure this out." And at the same time, I wanted to focus on like the marketing and the sales and the customer support. I didn't want to be fulfilling orders myself. So I partnered with just a great company in Grand Rapids, Michigan, Advanced Fulfillment. I don't mind giving them a shout out because they are in this beautiful old brick building warehouse that used to be a brass factory. It's near downtown Grand Rapids. And I showed up, I had a phone conversation with them and I showed up and I had a single pallet with like maybe 10 SKUs on it of Systainers, right? And they, they gave me the small corner of the warehouse saying, "Okay, you send us your orders, we'll ship this out," right? And now they tell me that after I left, they laughed and said, "This is never going to happen," right? How's this guy going to sell a plastic box for, $80 or whatever? But over time, it grew. So I used that 3PL. I interfaced to them with ShipStation, my whole stack. My store was on Shopify. And the whole system just flowed well. If there was an order issue, we would trade emails or text messages on it. And then eventually I grew. Now with the new acquisition and all that, I think we're well over 20,000 square foot of space because of things that we're racking, and we're about to double that size again with some other product coming in. So
Still using the same 3PO?
we are. They worked out so well. That's why I love giving them a shout out.
I
They took
wonder
me
how
on as a risk.
I'm sure you're
Yeah.
not just laying in some dusty small corner now anymore in
No,
the
we are not. We
warehouse.
are not. For a while they moved me to like the basement in this old brick building, which I didn't mind because they said you can have the whole basement, and they gave it to me at a fair price, right? And so we were down there, but we're far bigger than that basement now, and we've moved up to to somewhere with windows and lights, and it's beautiful. So it's worked out really well with that 3PL. Yeah.
So that leads me, I mean, this is a cool growth story, a cool partnership you have with this
hmm
company.
hmm
Now, you did do an exit of sorts with this. I know we're not going
Yep.
into the actual financials, but maybe walk us through how that looks, because this is, I think, unique. I
Yeah.
think if another wholesaler to retailer got this message without the second part you got, they'd be like, oh, fuck.
Yeah, 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 yeah. Yeah, maybe a key element that we actually haven't touched on, Greg, and I don't know if we want to go down this path first, is like I should say to the listeners out there, Sustainer Store was my side hustle at this point. It had been over that 6 years. Like I would wake up early in the morning and I would say at like 5:30 and I would drive to the warehouse. They get in at 6 and I might receive a new order. They'd say, "Hey, a pallet or pallets came in from Germany yesterday." And I would go and unpack the pallets and I'd put the stuff away because I wanted to get my hands on the product. I'd take some pictures. And then by 7:30, I'd be back home. I'd hop on my bike because I'd bike to work at that time and I'd bike and go do my day job. And then it would get to be 4:30, 5 o'clock. I'm back home. I might be answering customer emails, or during lunch, I was answering customer emails. So for that whole time, the 6 years that I did this dealership, I was doing it as a side hustle. And it started small. Don't get me wrong. It was like one or two orders, but it grew to where we were doing 100, 150 orders a month or more during holiday sales periods. And so, it was a significant going business. And the acquisition came about because Tanos, the manufacturer, had said they had been here in the US now for a couple of years working with dealers, and they had said, "We think we need to change strategies. We think we need to be a direct consumer channel, or we want to own the channel," right? And so they started conversations with me. And that first conversation, I was sitting at dinner with them, and it was, "Tim, we're going to shut down the dealership stuff." And I was like, "Oh dear." And it's like there's this pregnant pause and my heart goes into my throat and I'm like, "Oh man, it's over." Because I should say at the same time, like the week before, I was told in a day job that I had at that time that we were going to go through some transitions and I was going to get laid
Oof.
off.
When it
And so I
rains,
was
it
like,
pours.
I was thinking, yeah, so going into this dinner, I was thinking, man, this dealership's awesome. It's going to be my full-time gig. I can't wait to tell him I'm going to just go start kicking butt because I can put all my time into it. And he's like, "Tim, we're shutting down the dealers." And I was like, "Oh man, lows of lows." But then after that pregnant pause, he was like, "But we want to acquire you. We need help making, the e-commerce aspect happen." And so then it was like, rays from heaven, and light and joy. And that's not to say it was all pretty between that conversation and when things actually happened. And we can get into some of that. But it was really, they wanted to pull back on the dealerships because the manufacturer thought they could serve the customer better and they wanted that growth. They wanted that revenue aspect on their bottom line.
Yeah, so, like, what a roller coaster of emotion. I didn't know about the
Yeah.
layoff part. I didn't realize this
Mhm.
was your
Yeah.
side hustle. I thought your earlier side hustles, you went full in on this, but that makes the story even better. So they shut down the other dealers. They come to
hmm
you. Hey, we want to acquire you. Did they try to do it on their own? They just could not figure it out. Is that kind of what happened to them?
Yeah, well, my understanding now from this point of view was they were starting down the process of setting up some of their own e-commerce stuff. And they were initially wanting to launch that alongside dealers, but internally they just didn't have the resources or the focus to execute that here in the US. And so they were stumbling, they were dragging. They actually had some management change and some direction change in the business organization that's set up here. So Tanos currently, or at that time, they had 5, 6 employed individuals here that are trying to help deal with like dealers bringing in product from Germany, managing the warehouse, a little bit of they have a joint venture with another product called Bot. And so they were managing that product as well. So they were kind of spread thin and they weren't able to get the traction. And they realized the significance of, hey, Tim has a dealer that's working. The market loves Systainer Store. They love that brand. It works. It's all got the SEO with it now. It's got the name recognition. So it's like, why wouldn't we continue that?
This is such a I know you're on the seller side, and we'll go into a bit of the deal here in
Yeah.
a second, but
Yeah.
I always want to stress this to my audience and really anyone who will listen. Like, we always talk about business growth and all this stuff. It is often so much easier to just buy the thing that's already working than like
Yeah.
start over from scratch. And this is a perfect example of it. Like, I'm sure you're familiar with like vertical integration, right? Like, this
Yes,
is a
sir. Yep.
great example of Sustainer doing vertical integration with their best dealer. I've seen it in other businesses too. Like, let's say someone's selling an info product or something that has an affiliate
hmm
program, they'll go and
hmm
buy out their like top 5 affiliates, like their websites, their
Yeah.
email lists, all that kind of stuff. Like, so this is a great, like, what people in M&A call an inorganic growth strategy, right? Like acquiring
Yep.
people. So I think this is an awesome thing, and they already know it's proven because you're literally already
Yeah.
making the money before they do the deal. So walk me through what happened. Did they pay you a lump sum? Did they pay you a amount and then want you in as a consultant afterwards? Can you go into any of those details?
Yeah, I'm happy to talk about some of those details, not getting into the exact pricing, but the structure of the deal. Because I was in this space, say 1 year ago, right? We were having this conversation. February is kind of when things went out. And I went on this massive hunt, even though I had done lots of innovation work, lots of startup work, and other stuff in an M&A space. I was like, I've never thought about selling my side hustle. I never thought selling this. And it's like, so I had to figure out valuations and all that stuff. So it was about February when the conversation came up between me and the CEO of the local, US based organization. And from there, he quickly got approval from his board and the higher organization to say, yeah, let's pursue acquiring Sustainer Store, acquiring that brand. So we then really had to go through a handful of workshops in say March, April, and May, where these were a couple hour calls where we're just trying to hash out like, hey, here's the research I'm seeing on what the valuation could be, right? And then it would get into, well, what are we actually buying for it? So then we got into how do we make a list of the assets? What are the things that we're interested in? What all comes with this? Because I had some unique assets. It wasn't just an e-commerce system. It was like the whole flow through getting it from the warehouse and getting it shipped, right? It was the Instagram social media accounts. It's the email list. It's the Sustainer Works that I talked about, that whole other website that I set up. So there were several dynamics to that we had to try and put some pricing to. And at the end of the day, really, with any of these valuations, you could do multiples or net revenues, percentages, all that stuff. At the end of the day, it comes down to what can they afford? What are they willing to pay for it, right?
I
And
always
so,
say valuations are it's in the eye of the beholder. Unless you're selling with Empire Flippers, ours is the best for sure.
oh yeah, 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 yeah,
Not being
yeah. No, you
biased.
guys, yeah. I mean, I did not use Empire Flippers. I don't know that
Yeah,
we
yeah.
stated that explicitly. I did not use it, but I
We'll
went
get
to.
you to atone this sin later, Tim. Don't you
Oh,
worry.
oh yeah, don't worry. I've got a portfolio of businesses, and you
Perfect.
guys are high on my list. But you did have that free tool, and I'm not being paid to say this. You had that free tool on your website, that would help. You could put in some dynamics, and that was one of the things that I used to start saying, well, what would this business really bear in the market, right? Because as I was going into this conversation, I had a unique situation in that I was a dealer and they're saying they're going to shut me down and yet they want to buy me, right? So it wasn't like
Yeah.
an arm's length transaction, if you will. Like there's this
Right.
dynamic where they could exert pressure. And so we had to And they were all good about this, right? We recognize this pressure, but we had to try and say, like, what is a fair market value for this business? So I needed to collect resources, and your tool was one of those resources that I
I'm glad it
consulted.
helped. There is a
Yeah.
surprising amount of people. I mean, we use it as a lead gen tool, right? It gives
Yep.
you a
Yep.
rough estimate,
Yeah.
but we have a lot of lead gen that use it so they can go sell it privately using that like
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
information.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Which, more power to them, right? But
Yeah.
that's cool. So you ended up working out a deal. It sounds like they were, pretty cool. They could have literally just shut you down and then you had nothing. Like,
They could have.
so
Yeah,
it
they
sounds
could
like
have.
you guys found a workable deal for a lump sum payout, and then they offer you consulting afterwards, right?
Yeah, yeah. So we can go through that. So it was like those first 3 months that I said, kind of March, April, May. We worked on like some dynamics of the deal, and then some things got busy in both their life and my life, and waiting for some approvals. And so kind of June, July, August kind of started slipping by. I was like, come on, because we said, hey, let's get this done by August one.
It's
How
such an
hard can it
M&A
be?
thing.
Right? Right?
Yeah.
And then we finally signed the paperwork. I think it was like September 30th, and October 1 was the transition date. But there was a lot of noodling right there at the end with some legal language too that, was just kind of painful. But, listeners should know if they're going through it, that's going to happen and just plan for it in the schedule. So my deal ended up through these series of conversations, this, 6 months of, negotiating, working things out. Initially, they wanted to say, just buy Systainer store. And as I said, my day job was also going away. So I was like, hey guys, I'm willing to do some work with you guys. And as we went through this, we were talking to, hey, what's my market rate? What kind of innovation stuff? What kind of role would I have? And this organization that was actually buying it, without getting into a lot of technical detail, it was a joint venture. And so the way that joint venture gets cash is both parties have to agree to put cash in to make this deal happen. And they were willing to do it to make the deal happen, but they weren't willing to invest the kind of money that they needed to say, hire me full time at what was a typical W-2 salary, right? So as we got into, say, maybe halfway through the negotiations, we had to craft some different options. Like, hey, do we want Tim just around for consulting? Like, hey, how did you do this? Do we want Tim, say, part time, just manning customer service? Or do we want Tim part of the team? And so we crafted some things that made it be a small consulting fee, but then a return on portions of the revenue as well that I was, generating through Sustainer Store. So there was motivation for me to make sure that this thing launched. The acquisition deal itself also got spread out through a period of time. Over a handful of years here, I will be getting an earnout. There was a lump sum upfront fee, maybe not as high as I'd wanted it to be, but I think, again, we came to an agreement on how this whole thing would work out, and we figured out projections and backstops in case things don't hit projections, and we were able to strike a deal that allowed them to buy it now and allowed me to get involved. I'd say nearly full time. I still wanted to reserve some time because I've got more things I want to do, more businesses to launch. So
I think that's smart. And I bet if in your situation, the earnout would have been higher if it wasn't this super weird situation where your wholesaler is
yeah,
basically buying you, right? They have the ability to shut
yep,
you down. So you were negotiating from a position of weakness, but it sounds like that they
yeah,
were good, which is, nice to hear. Yeah, the noodling with the M&A thing, man. I tell all sellers, like, you are going to, like, a deal dies 3 times before it
yeah,
gets sold. Like, that's normal, right? Like,
yeah,
the
yeah,
buyer does an offer, the seller's like insulted at how low it is, and then the seller gets no other bite, so he reaches
yep,
back out to the buyer. The buyer's like, "No, I'm not into it now." And then like 3 months later, the buyer can't find a deal, so the same buyer comes back like, "Hey, you still interested?" Right? So like happens all the time, and lawyers and legalese is another big one too, for sure. So you got like a whole
yeah.
crash course of how it works, right?
Oh, it was. And then again, I had some familiarity from this from daytime kind of job, but living it, owning it, being on like the person that's going to eventually get the bank account, with money in it, or having to release these assets, like it is nerve wracking. Like there was times, and I mean, initially up, I was a little afraid, like, is this going to die? But then later in times, it was just more of like I was kind of worried, like, who's going to raise their head? What ugly monster is going to come up here that could actually shut this down? And I kept getting assurances it's not going to get shut down. But then they'd be like, my lawyer and I would craft some language, change some language, send it back within 24 hours of them sending me, a latest draft. But then they would go 2 weeks before I get the draft back.
Crickets.
And that
Yeah.
2 weeks was just agonizing. After 3 days, I'd say, hey, when are you going to get this? Oh, the guy says he's going to do it tomorrow. Oh, his wife was sick. Oh, I don't want to say they're all excuses per se, but it was agonizing as being the seller. And you just got to power through it. You got to believe you're doing the right thing. So,
Yeah, absolutely. And it is usually the buyer holdup. In most cases, I've seen sometimes it's the seller, but usually it's the buyer. And they often have like multiple deals going on. So, like, while this is like your central focus, you're just like one of many things, depending on who the buyer
Yeah.
is, of course. But yeah, if private equity or like family office are buying, I always joke it's like the financial version of the doctor like checking your prostate or something. It's like
Yeah.
never
Yeah.
going to be comfortable. Like you're just like
Yeah. Yeah.
naked as they're looking at all your P&L and like asking all the questions. You're just like, oh God, is that mistake the deal killer?
Yep.
So I
Yep.
feel you on
Yep.
that. So you're consulting with them now. The deal's gone through. So that's awesome.
Yes, sir.
Congrats. What kind of stuff are you doing with them? Like, are you helping them are you taking some of their assets that the German company has as well and like kind of integrating them, or walk me a bit through like how the consulting is working?
Totally, totally. Well, overall, I would say the consulting is working well, but going into it, you got to know what you're getting into, right? And so, one of the reasons that I saw this acquisition and then doing consulting was because I wanted to do a team. I had a vision for where Sustainer could go, in that brief interim of, going from full, a day job to like, hey, I'm going to do this full time. I've always had this vision and just never enough time to execute. And so I really built up that vision, and now we're actually getting to execute it because there's a team. There's someone that can help with marketing and emails, right? We can spend some money on some vendors to do things on the website that we couldn't do. And so since I've joined them, we relaunched the website. We rebuilt the whole website. We then made it so that a whole new service that has really catapulted our growth, which is you can change out the handle and the catches to the different colors on the site, right? It seems silly. Like I used to just sell only a light gray box and only a yellow box and only an orange box. But now you can get a light gray box with yellow handle and yellow catch if you want, because customers want to organize by color or they want to match it to a tool brand. And it was always a value proposition that I just never was able to serve with the way I did it. But now you do it all on the website and you check out. So there was a bit of like building one the website, but then how in the world do you do that operationally on the back end? And so I've helped to set up that whole system, lots of APIs, lots of working on the tools, working with the warehouse to say, okay, here's how you actually put these configured now, and then what's the pricing scheme? Because now they're doing labor, not just pick and pack, right? They're
Right.
doing some labor to change things out. I've helped a lot of on the business side, and then I continue to be like one of their, I don't know if you would say brands. I go by Systim because a lot of things are Systainer, SysAZ, and so I'm Systim. I'm one of their brands, not as much for it at the moment, but customer email support. I'm going to do some videos in the coming year, things like that that help to go to trade shows, help them interact with the audience out there. And it's great. I've got this team that really makes it possible, right? That's what again, on the consulting front, if you're going to go into it, you got to have boundaries and say, hey, I'm going to do this scope, right? And then know that you want to work with this team. And if those things don't exist, you either need to really cut back on the consulting or not do it at all.
Oh yeah, 100%, man. Like I remember when I think I was like 20 maybe, and I first started like really getting into business, and I did this public speech in front of all these realtors and insurance brokers.
Hmm.
I was talking about relationship marketing. Basically, I was selling this thing where you can send out a postal card or like almost like
Uh-huh.
a holiday greeting card, but you could customize it and you can set it up like an
Yeah.
autoresponder, but a physical one, and it's great for
Hmm.
sales, right? Like a thank you card or prospecting card. Like I used it to get a couple copywriting gigs, and I sold a consulting package for like 5 grand. And I'm 20 and I get paid five
Hmm.
grand for like 30 minutes of speaking. Like, whoa. And fast
Yeah.
forward, only one person bought. And fast forward like 3 months in, 4 months in, I could barely like afford my gas to get to the guy's office to
Hmm.
continue the consulting. And he looked at me, he's like, Greg, you know why I paid you 5 grand that day? I was like, why? It's because I knew you way undervalued yourself and you'd be working like a dog for me. Your hourly rate at this point is like $5.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Like
Yeah.
he was a small business consultant as well, and he told me, "Let this be like a valuable like business lesson for you on pricing."
Hmm.
And it just blew my mind as like a young 20-year. Like, what have I done to myself?
Yeah.
But
That was a good
yeah, I
lesson,
feel
right?
you. Yeah, you got to have the
Yeah.
right
It
expectations, otherwise you screw yourself as a consultant.
Yeah, it's one of those things where, I debated myself and my wife and my family, we talked a bit, and it's like I could have chose to not do consulting, only get like the earn out, right? And then go get like a day job. And then it's kind of like I get the day job salary plus this earn out, life is good. But because I wanted something different, because I wanted to see the growth and the vision, I still believe in this. There's a period of letting it go. It's not my baby anymore, if you will. Some people like to talk to their startups or their businesses like that, but it's like I saw the opportunity to take it to the next level. So I was willing to do the consulting, work at a consulting fee, work at a percentage of revenue because I believe in it. And we'll see how it goes throughout this year.
So if you were to give anyone, you've successfully sold a business, if you were to give my
Yeah.
audience advice, What would you say is the most important thing for them to have in their mind when they go to make an exit?
It's a good question because I've been around, startups and some of the M&A stuff. In my side hustle, I never thought about selling it. It was just one of those things that was always going to be there. I thought maybe at some point I'd phase it out or whatever, but I wasn't building it for the purpose of selling. So maybe there's some aspects of making sure, if you something changes in life and now you got to sell it, or you're building something for the purpose of selling it, right? You got to know your audience, you got to know yourself and manage your emotions through this whole thing. Once you get into the selling process, it's like being clear on goals and giving yourself room to breathe because everything is negotiable. Everything is negotiable. It's not always you're going to get it, right? But it's like really having to have patience and peace as you deal with whoever is buying. You might talk to the CEO and get a handshake deal, but then you got to talk to the lawyer and you got to talk to the CFO and you got to talk to director of marketing and a vice president. All this long chain that they're going to have doubts and different demands and things like that. And so it's like really being trying to have peace and control your emotions through that process. And part of it too, though, is like this mourning that occurs maybe because if you're selling something because you don't want to, or you're selling something because life changed, or you're just selling your baby because you worked on it forever, you got to reserve time for this mourning aspect of like, hey, I'm going to let this change and I'm going to a new adventure in life. I don't know if that's a singular thing, but it's just really give yourself space and manage your emotions through it.
I think that is great advice. Not enough people talk about stuff like that. Like, I
Hmm.
bring up the idea of emotional equity all the time, which is the
Hmm.
reason why I think entrepreneurs tend to overprice themselves in the beginning, and that kills
Hmm.
their deal
Yep.
because they have so much emotional attachment to it, right?
Yeah, you bet.
It
You
like
bet.
help them quit their job, travel the world, whatever, right? But then there's the postpartum depression after you sell the
Yeah.
business, right? Because
Yeah.
like you said, a lot of them, this is my baby,
Yeah.
so
Yeah.
there's like you get paid like a couple $1 million suddenly in your bank account, and you're happy for like 5 minutes, and now you're like, what do I do now? Like I have no purpose.
Yeah. Yeah.
So
Yeah.
these are all
Yeah.
important things for an entrepreneur to figure out, like, and as you said, like control that emotion a bit and understand the journey. So I think that's great advice, man. Before we get into
Yep.
the rapid fire section, I know,
Hmm.
at least I believe I know, you transitioned like after you started this e-commerce business, you also built a SaaS business, right? So
Yeah.
tell me a little bit about that. Is that still going? Is that part of Sustainer? Or is it something different?
Yeah. So my day job, I've had kind of had two W-2 jobs, if you will, since moving back to the States from Asia when I was doing theme park engineering stuff. Those day jobs were both for corporates. I mentioned Steelcase as one. Another one was a corporate venture studio of sorts. And my goal, the reason I existed there was to design and build new business models, prototype and launch businesses. A lot of those were in the SaaS or the IoT, the Internet of Things kind of space. So dealing with a lot of cloud computing and data science, but then the sensors collecting stuff from an office space or in other applications. And really, what I learned and why I wanted to go into those fields was just what is the pattern of designing a business? Because again, I want to build awesome things with great people, have fun, and make money, right? It's like I needed to learn like a little bit more of this pattern of how do you intentionally build businesses. And through, say, that 8, 9 years that I did that for those two corporates, that pattern became quite a skill that I honed, right? And so whether it was SaaS or IoT or an e-commerce, or if I just want to go sell my personal services, there's always this pattern of like, identifying a need in a market, figuring out how you're going to serve that need, then prototyping, can someone pay for it? Will they pay for it? How much will they pay for it? And then repeating, how do you provide that service? And it sounds sounds so bare bones, but there are skills to it. So many dynamics on, well, are you delivering it a digital good or a physical good, and what's the customer like? There's so many dynamics that go into it. And so the SaaS and the IoT stuff that I developed for the corporates, some of those still exist. Some of them were shut down, but some of them still exist. I see posts on LinkedIn for some of those products and stuff, and it just makes me smile. It's kind of like, the roller coasters and stuff that I worked on. Every now and then I will go to an airport, business travel, and I'll see someone wear Revenge of the Mummy, the roller coaster ride at Universal Studios. And it's like, that was my roller coaster. That's what I built. And so it's like, that guy's wearing a shirt because of something I did, 20 years ago. I think it's hilarious. I get a lot of gratification out of that. So.
So are you still in the SaaS world as well, or
I would say I do a little bit of
a
consulting with
little bit
some
of
of those things.
consulting?
I don't
Gotcha.
personally have my own SaaS business at the moment. There
Well, I
are
do
some
have a
things that are on the plate.
marketplace, Tim. I'll
Yes,
get you. I'll
exactly.
get
I believe in a portfolio of income, Greg, and a portfolio of businesses. So there's some ideas that I have cooking. Nothing in motion at the moment, but
Yeah,
micro
awesome.
SaaS businesses are super fascinating to me. Like you don't have to go be an Uber, you don't have to go be like a LinkedIn, you don't have to go do something like these micro SaaS businesses where like one, two, three, 4 person kind of teams can set these up. and run a healthy business, a healthy bottom line, and make some income. I love those ideas. So,
Oh, me too, man. I think it's a fascinating space, like even digital
hmm
products, like a lot of these one person shows, right? Like with
hmm
automation, AI, like you can launch something, like you could spin something up like quite quick, as long as you're
yeah,
like just focus on something for a little bit of time. I think it's cool that you study so many different business models, but we are towards the end of the podcast here, and I do have three
sure,
rapid fire questions for you. So I'll ask you
yeah,
three quick questions. You give me three quick answers. Are you ready?
go,
All right. No pressure here, Tim. If they're not good,
yeah,
though, I cannot publish the episode. So don't worry.
okay,
Okay.
yeah.
Question number one. What are the best hidden growth opportunities in the e commerce world right now?
I thought about this, and the first thing to say is I am not a guru. I don't study the e-commerce world, but I'll say what I think is interesting is that I'll say e-commerce products, so physical goods that are appealing a little bit more to a business, like small business or small industrial business, or I would say local government municipalities. And so I know that's kind of broad. I am currently investigating a couple of businesses, and there are electronic devices or hand tools of sorts that really appeal to that segment. And it's like, it's not a consumer segment, it's not something you're going to find on Amazon, and they appeal to that segment. And I feel like, these niche businesses can be served well. I would say also any e-commerce business that I'm going to call as a system product. And by that, I mean there's multiple parts and pieces. And as someone gets into it, they want more of this and some of that, right? That system business, those kind of e-commerce products, I think are very exciting because you can get the repeat business, because you can make a place for yourself, and then you can build a community around it as well. And so that, now it's not just some, no offense, candle, or jewelry e-commerce store. It is something where you can kind of own and have some direction in the community and how you release products.
I'll have to introduce you to some of my sellers who are selling candles to see what they have to say about
Yeah.
that.
Yeah. No offense. Every business has some work. So,
I totally agree on the small business and industrial stuff. Like I said, like I am fascinated by e-commerce stores that can have both B2C and B2B. I think
mhm,
B2B commerce is kind of a really like underrated opportunity. Like a lot of people don't think of
mhm,
B2B with e-commerce, and I just think they're
mhm.
missing the boat. I think there's a lot that can be done there.
Agree.
Okay.
Agree.
Second
Yep.
question. What tools or resources can people use to help them grow their e-commerce business?
Yeah, so I've got a couple. I would say, and I'm sure this has been said on previous podcasts, like if you're not using ChatGPT or Claude or some AI agent to help you be a co-creator in your business, you're missing out on some efficiencies. And again, like co-creator is like a big word there for me. You shouldn't just have it say, give me a product description and you blindly copy paste it, right? Or give me an email and blindly copy paste it. Like you really need to craft it because it still needs to be your own style. I like my email, shortening and things like that, and punching it up really happened well when I started using ChatGPT a couple of years ago. And then two other tools that I use a lot, and maybe this comes from my engineering background, was I use Pipedream and Retool. Pipedream it's an automator of sorts. If you've heard of Zapier, right? It's a form of Zapier, but it's a little bit more engineering. I can write raw Python code in it to do the things I want. And then Retool is a bit of like an internal user interface, but you could also do some automating through it. Again, it's not low code, no code. There's a little bit of code that's going to be needed, but I had to create some specific tools for my warehouse as we got into, say, this configuration stuff that we mentioned earlier. I had to create some custom things where, hey, every time an order is put on hold, send me an email because I wasn't watching it all day, right? So I could make sure I could contact the customer and then I'd do an automated email to the customer. So I use Retool and Pipedream to create these automations that, as a part-time, attendee, as a side hustle, it could automate some of the things that I would do routinely.
I love that. I think finding more and more ways to automate is just absolutely the way most entrepreneurs need to go.
Hmm
I was talking to an agency owner. She's now starting to automate her sales calls with,
Yeah.
I forget what she's using. I think it is ChatGPT with combined with something else. But I mean, these are still like
hmm
low level introductory calls. So it's probably more
Yep.
fair to say it's like an appointment setting. But yeah, I mean, that's amazing, right? Like that's amazing stuff that people can do these days. All right.
Yeah.
Final question for you, my friend, and probably the hardest question. What has been your funniest moment working in the e-commerce world?
Yeah. I wrote down a couple stories
Oh,
to
you
tell
came
here.
prepared. Most people never even read the questions.
Yeah. I really appreciate it because, it's hard to reflect on what might be my funniest moment. There is one that I reflect on, and it goes to like the whole business research and then, getting conviction in what you're doing. Because sometimes You launch a new business and it starts off slow, or it doesn't meet expectations at first. When I was doing my initial research for Systainer and Systainer Store, I said there was like one or two dealers that were kind of here in the US. I found an old domain website that was like, well, maybe I won't say what it was, but I found an old domain and they used to sell some Systainers. And I was able to hunt down the guy that owned the domain and owned the business because he had launched some other businesses, so doing domain lookups and things like that. And I remember trading a handful of emails with him. And, so I asked point blank, why don't you sell Systainers anymore? Why'd you stop doing that? And his response was, it's an inferior product and nobody wants it. Right. Like that's exactly. And he says, XYZ toolbox. I won't name the brand, but he said XYZ toolbox is far better. And I'm looking at that and I'm thinking, well, that's really your opinion, right? And none of my other market research was showing, that opinion. And so I found that to be a funny moment. I had to weigh that, but I found it to be a funny moment when I reflect back on it and the success that I've had over this, the last 6 years and this acquisition and all that sort of stuff, where it's like, you know, it's made me significant amount of money. And if I would have just taken his advice as it was, without doing that whole market research, I could have missed out on this opportunity.
It's funny how stories like that coalesce. You just reminded me of a story when I was in the oil field and like trying to break into internet marketing.
Hmm.
Like my dad had this older friend. He's like this retired electrician, salt of the earth kind of guy, and
Yeah.
extremely rude and grouchy all the time. Like I'm good buddies with a lot of my tradespeople, but brothers and sisters out there. But this guy was just a mean dude. He was funny though, which was why my dad was so good friends with him. But he told me like no one ever made money writing, and that was my main thing. My
Yeah.
hobby was writing, and for the side hustle
Yeah.
in internet marketing, I was doing copywriting, right? And I look back on that now. Like I wrote this article for Empire Flippers a few years ago, like almost over half a decade ago now. And that one article is probably not even 1,000 words, led to hundreds of thousands of dollars as credit on file with us. And it always
Yeah.
makes me laugh. Like, yeah, man, no one makes money with writing.
Yeah, exactly. I
You're
mean,
thinking
these
that way.
extreme statements, right? Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. If you got time, I got another story or two I could
Sure.
share
Yeah.
quick.
Yeah.
Another bad moment was sometimes, when you're in the e-commerce space, of course, you got to deal with customers and lost packages, and maybe the product was broken when it arrived, something happened. I had this customer and it was just a scathing email. Like, I mean, he was threatening me. Like, I read it to my wife and it was like, she was like, should you report this to the police? Like, he's threatening your life. And it's like, it was because the package wasn't delivered. The UPS thing said it was delivered and the package wasn't delivered. And so it's like, you got to take humble, take all the emotion out of it. Oh, sir, I'm sorry, your package was late. Let's get with UPS. Let's see what it was. And then like another day went by and it was just, oh my goodness, these emails were, all the four-letter words, whatever. And I couldn't believe how bad this was. And then I was getting with UPS and, filling out the paperwork for a lost package. And then like on the third day, he wrote back and said, sorry, my neighbor had the package. Thank you. And it was over. I was like, how do you deal with that? Right. And it's like I went through like this emotional, like I'm getting all attacked, and he's calling my wife and family names and threatening my life, and then it's like, sorry, my neighbor had the package, right?
This is why the most important hire as you build your e-commerce store is customer service to be as the
Yes.
bulwark against this,
Yes.
to keep your mindset fresh,
Yes. Yep. Yep.
I've had a guy he wasn't mean, but he could be a bit of a prick, and he just didn't think things through what he was saying. But he was
Hmm.
just like going on about EF, about how we weren't like he sells the biggest businesses, that type of thing. I looked at like the
Yeah.
businesses he was selling with us. It's like, dude, like most of your business is like 150K. Like, the big
Yeah.
we just sold our $13 million business. Like, what do
Yeah.
you
Yeah.
mean?
Yeah.
And he just like it reminded me a lot when I was in furniture sales. Like people always say, like, "Oh, you mark up your prices so high so you can make all this money." I was
Hmm.
like, "Dude, like after all of our costs, we make like $50 per chair." And like you're not thinking about the lights, you're not thinking about the real estate
Yeah.
rental, you're not thinking about the advertising that brought you here,
Yeah.
like all this stuff,
Yeah.
right? So people can be just crazy. So, but my parting advice to anyone listening: hire customer service first as you grow.
Yeah. Yeah. Do it well.
Well,
Yep.
man, this was an absolute pleasure. If someone wanted to reach out to you, connect with you on anything, maybe even reach out to you for some e-commerce consulting, where would you
Yeah.
recommend them to go find you?
Yeah, well, you can certainly find me at LinkedIn, Timothy Sweeter or Timothy D. Sweeter. And then I also have a personal website, Sweeter, SWIETER.net. You can look up there and you'll get links to LinkedIn and maybe I have my Instagram account on there. But surely you can connect through there.
Awesome. Well, we'll put all those links in the show notes, and thanks for coming on, man.
Yep. Yes, well, I love this, Greg. I love this whole space of small business and e-commerce and acquisition. So I wish you and any of your listeners good luck in whatever businesses they're pursuing.
Yeah, absolutely. Maybe we'll get you on a second time to see where you're going next in chapter two.
I think that's a great goal. That's a great goal.
Awesome. There you have it. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope it got you inspired at all the different things that are happening in this industry. And of course, if you just want to buy a highly profitable business, you can always go to empireflippers.com/marketplace, or maybe you want to make an exit of your highly profitable business, and you could go to empireflippers.com/sell your site. I've been your host, Greg. If you enjoyed this episode, make sure you leave a review, give us a like, a follow, share it across social media. Talk to you all soon. See you on the next episode.